She heard every word. Standing behind a door that she had touched with her fingertips just a moment before, about to push it open, about to walk through it and into the rest of her life. She heard every word. The room on the other side of that door was full of men her fiancé had known for 20 years. Men who had built things with him, who had drunk with him, who had watched him become who he was. And in the particular way that men speak when they believe no women are present, they were speaking freely, laughing freely. And her fiancé, Tund Adeyemi, the man she had loved for 3 years, the man who had proposed to her in a restaurant in Paris with her grandmother's ring. Her fiancé was speaking the most freely of all. She stood in the corridor of the Eco Grand Hotel in Lagos, in a wedding gown that had taken 4 months to make, with her hair pinned and her lips painted and her hands shaking in a way she could not make stop, and she listened to the man she was about to marry explain to his friends exactly why he had chosen her. It was not because he loved her. She did not cry. Not then. She pressed one hand flat against the door and one hand flat against the wall, and she breathed in the way her mother had once taught her to breathe when something too large was trying to move into a space too small for it. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Slow. Slow. And then she turned and walked back down the corridor, and the heels of her wedding shoes made a sound on the marble floor like something being counted down. But to understand what she did next, you need to understand who she was before any of this began. You need to understand the woman standing in that corridor. Not the gown, not the ring, not the name the Lagos newspapers put in their society pages every 6 months. You need to understand Adeze Okonkwo, where she came from, what she had made of herself, and what it had cost her to be made. Adeze was born in a single room in Onitsha, on a Wednesday morning in the wet season, during a rainstorm so heavy it knocked the electricity out for 3 days. Her mother, Chidinma, told the story every year on Adeze's birthday, told it the way some women tell certain stories, not as a record of the past but as a preparation for the future. Your beginning was loud, her mother always said. Do not be surprised that your life is the same. Her father, Emeka Okonkwo, was a spare parts trader who worked 14 hours a day and loved his family the way a man loves the only roof he has ever had, completely without ceremony, and with a particular terror of losing it. He was not educated past secondary school. He had no connections. He had no land in his name and no savings account that stayed healthy past the 3rd week of any month. What he had was stubbornness and a daughter who seemed, from the moment she could speak, to be conducting some private argument with the world about what it owed her. Adeze read everything she could find. She borrowed books from neighbors. She stayed late in the school library when there was a school library, and when there was not, she sat under the fluorescent light of a provisions shop owned by a woman named Ngozi, who never charged her for the electricity and sometimes sent her home with bread. She passed her exams the way some people survive disasters, by refusing at every point to accept that survival was optional. She won a scholarship to university in Enugu, then another to study economics in London, then a job offer from a firm in Abuja that paid her more money in a month than her father earned in a year, a fact she carried inside her like a bruise she had learned to stop pressing. She sent money home every month. She called her mother every Sunday. She visited at Christmas and sometimes at Easter, and every time she arrived in Onitsha with her Lagos clothes and her London accent that crept in around the edges of her Igbo, she felt the particular dislocation of a person who has traveled somewhere she cannot quite return from. By the time she was 34 years old, Adeze Okonkwo had built something that people in Lagos called a success story. She had her own wealth management firm with offices on Victoria Island. She had a reputation in financial circles that preceded her like a name written in all capitals. She had an apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lagoon, and she stood at those windows sometimes in the early morning with a cup of tea going cold in her hands and looked at the water and thought about nothing and everything at the same time. What she did not have, and this is the part that her mother brought up with increasing frequency during their Sunday phone calls, was a husband. This is not as simple as it sounds. Adeze was not a woman who needed saving. She was not a woman who went to bed at night and felt incomplete. She was a woman who had organized her life with the same precision she applied to everything else, and she had organized it in a way that worked, which meant she had organized it in a way that left very little room for someone else to exist inside of it. She had had relationships. She had ended them, or they had ended themselves against the particular hard edge of her work ethic. She had not been heartbroken. She had been inconvenienced, which she privately knew was more honest than heartbroken. And this honesty was one of the things she respected about herself. And then she met Tund. She met him at a conference in Abuja about foreign investment in West African markets. He was 3 chairs down from her at a panel discussion, and he asked a question that was so precisely the right question that she turned to look at him before she had made any decision to turn. He was tall in the way that some men are tall, not aggressively, not as if the height were something they had worked for, but simply as a fact of his construction. He had a face that was specific rather than handsome, which meant she remembered it. He laughed at something the moderator said, a real laugh, brief and genuine, and she found herself doing a thing she almost never did, which was waiting to see what he would do next. His name was Babatunde Adeyemi. He went by Tund. He had grown up in Ibadan, the son of a retired professor of literature and a woman who had spent 30 years as a pharmacist and still spoke about drug interactions with the passion of someone who had just discovered them. He had studied engineering at Lagos, then gone to MIT for his master's degree, then returned to Nigeria at a time when most of his classmates were doing the opposite, and built a construction and infrastructure company that now had contracts across 6 West African countries. He was 40 years old. He was not married. He had been engaged once before, briefly, to a woman who had left him for a man who was willing to live outside Nigeria, which was a thing Tund was not. He loved Nigeria the way some people love an impossible relative, with clear eyes about what it was, and without any intention of going anywhere. They talked for 2 hours after the conference panel ended. They had dinner in the hotel restaurant and talked for 3 more hours. She told him things she rarely told people on a first meeting, not because she was careless but because the conversation had the particular quality of a room with good acoustics. Everything said in it landed clearly, nothing echoed strangely. He listened the way some men never learn to listen, without waiting for his turn, without organizing his response while her words were still in the air. He simply listened, and then he responded to what she had actually said, and it was so unremarkable and so rare that she felt something shift in the architecture of her evening. They exchanged numbers. He called the following day. They met again the week after in Lagos. Within 3 months she had rearranged, quietly and without announcement, the schedule of her mornings and evenings to include him in them, and she was aware that this was a kind of surrender that she had never made before, and she did not object to it the way she had expected to. Her mother met him at Christmas. Her mother, who had raised Adiz on a combination of Igbo pragmatism and absolute love, sat with Tund for 40 minutes in the front room of the house in Onitsha, asked him things that would have sounded impertinent from anyone else, and then came into the kitchen where Adiz was helping with the soup and said, in a voice low enough not to carry, "That man is good." Not good like a gift, her mother clarified. Good like a foundation. You can build on it. Her father shook Tund's hand at the gate when he was leaving and held it a moment longer than necessary, the way a man holds something he wants to remember the weight of. Tund proposed in Paris in February, just before her 35th birthday. They were at a small restaurant in the Marais that she had loved on a work trip 3 years before and mentioned only once, in passing, over dinner in Lagos. He had remembered. He had booked the same table. He had, somehow, arranged for the ring, her maternal grandmother's ring, a thin gold band with a pale green stone, which her mother had been keeping in a cloth pouch in the bottom of her jewelry box for years, to be brought from Onitsha to Paris, which had required a logistical operation that her mother later described with the satisfied dignity of someone who has executed a complicated mission successfully. She said yes before he had finished asking. She said yes and then she laughed, not at him but at herself, at the discovery of how simple the word was when it was the right word. And Tund, who almost never cried, pressed his hand over his mouth for a moment and looked at the wall, and a single tear ran down his face before he could stop it. They planned the wedding for 8 months later. They chose the Eco Grand Hotel because it was large enough for both their families and most of their combined professional networks, which, combined, amounted to several hundred people, which was not extravagance but necessity. Adiz managed the planning with the same methodical intelligence she applied to mergers. She made lists. She kept schedules. She made decisions quickly and changed them rarely, and only when presented with evidence rather than opinion. Tund stayed out of most of it with cheerful deference, appearing reliably when his presence was required and disappearing when it was not, which was one of the many reasons she had decided to spend her life with him. And she was happy. This requires saying plainly because it is a thing that can get lost in what came after. She was genuinely, specifically, daily happy in the way that a person is happy when the life they are living has finally caught up with the life they deserved. She sang in the kitchen on Saturday mornings. She sent her mother voice notes that rambled for 10 and 12 minutes about nothing important. She fell asleep easily. She woke up not dreading the day. She did not know, in those 8 months, what was happening on the other side of the life she was building. She did not know about the meeting that had taken place in Tun's office 3 weeks after he returned from Paris, when one of his senior directors, a man named Bedibo, who had worked with Tun since the company's first year and who owed his entire career to Tun's loyalty, had sat across the desk and told him, with the careful delivery of a man breaking news he has rehearsed, that the company's largest contract was in danger. The government infrastructure project that represented 40% of their revenue, the one that had been Tun's anchor for 5 years, had been quietly reassigned to a competitor whose connection to the new Minister of Works was a thing that could not be competed against with quality or price. She did not know that Tund had spent 4 months trying to find a solution that did not involve what he eventually concluded was the only available solution. She did not know that the only available solution had a name. The name was Adiz. Not Adiz as his fiancé. Adiz as the CEO of Okonkwo Wealth Management, whose firm managed assets worth more than $2 billion, whose name opened doors in the offices of finance ministers and central bank governors, whose particular combination of Igbo family connections and Lagos professional reputation and London-trained expertise made her, in the specific crisis Tund was facing, the most valuable relationship a struggling infrastructure company could possibly have. She did not know that Gbadebo had been the one to suggest it, sitting across from Tund in that same office. He had said it plainly the way Gbadebo said everything. You are already with her. The firm needs her connections more than you need the marriage to be about what you want it to be about. That is not cynicism. That is mathematics. And Tund had said nothing, which Gbadebo later told him, was as good as agreement. She did not know that 3 of Tund's closest friends, the men who were in that room at the Eco Grand Hotel on the morning of her wedding, had known this from the beginning, had watched him move through 8 months of an engagement they understood differently than she did, had watched him be, by all appearances, genuinely affectionate with her, genuinely attentive, genuinely present, and had concluded, each in his own private way, that the calculus had simply become more complicated than the plan had accounted for. What no one had accounted for, not Gbadebo, not the 3 friends, not even Tund, who had told himself a story about the situation that let him sleep, was that Tund had fallen in love with her, not as an afterthought, not alongside the plan, but underneath it, through it, in spite of it, in the way that something planted for one reason sometimes grows into something entirely different. He had fallen in love with the specific way she argued, the specific way she moved through a room, the specific way she pressed her hand to her collarbone when she was thinking and did not know she was doing it. He had fallen in love with her, and he was going to marry her, and the plan had become something he could not look at directly anymore, the way you cannot look directly at something that is part of you and also wrong. This is what he told his friends that morning in the hotel room, in the half-joking, half-confessing way that men tell the truest things about themselves. He said it almost lightly, the way men who do not know how to be vulnerable say the most vulnerable things, with a laugh underneath it, with the plausible deniability of a man who might be joking. He said, "She doesn't know that's how this started. She thinks I chose her because I loved her from the beginning." And one of his friends said, "Does it matter how it started?" And Tund said, into a silence that was longer than any of them had planned, "I don't know. I think it might." What she heard, standing in that corridor in her wedding gown, was all of it. The beginning of the story she had not known was being told. The plan she had not known was the frame around what she had believed was simply love. The original reason. She heard it not in sequence but in fragments, a name, a figure, a reference to the contract, a reference to Gbadebo, a reference to what she could do for the company. And she arranged these fragments in the time it takes a brilliant woman to understand the shape of a thing from its edges, which was not very long at all. She stood in that corridor and she understood that she had been chosen the way a city chooses a location for a port. Strategically, with full knowledge of her value. And then she turned and walked back down the marble hall, and her hands were completely still, which was worse than when they had been shaking. She went to the room where her bridesmaids were waiting. Her closest friend and chief bridesmaid, Obiageli, who everyone called Obi, who had known Adiz since they were 12 years old, sharing a bench in a school in Onitsha, who had helped Adiz move to Lagos and move to London and move back, and had witnessed every significant event of Adiz's adult life with the loyalty of a woman who had decided, decades ago, that this particular friendship was a thing worth protecting. Obi took one look at her face and said nothing. She simply crossed the room and took both of Adiz's hands in hers, and waited. Adiz said, "I need to think." Obi said, "Okay." Adiz said, "I need everyone to leave this room for 10 minutes. Obi cleared the room in 3 minutes. She had always been efficient. Alone, Adiz sat on the edge of the small sofa by the window. Outside, 12 floors below, Lagos was doing what Lagos always does. Moving, loud and indifferent and alive. A bus horn, a hawker's call, the distant percussion of a generator. She could hear all of it the way you hear things when your mind has gone somewhere too large for ordinary sound to reach it. She sat with her hands in her lap and she thought. She thought about her father at the gate in Onitsha, holding Tun's hand a moment too long. She thought about her mother in the kitchen saying good like a foundation. She thought about Paris in February, the small restaurant in the Marais, the way Tund had pressed his hand over his mouth. She thought about what a man in love looks like and whether she had been seeing it or something that resembled it so closely the difference required equipment she did not have. She thought about what it means to be valued for what you can do rather than who you are, and how she had organized her entire life to prove that those two things were not in conflict, and how it was possible that she had been wrong about this in a way she could not have predicted and could not, from where she was sitting, fully see the shape of. She thought about walking into that reception hall and marrying him anyway. She considered this carefully and completely, the way she considered financial instruments she did not yet understand, without rushing toward a conclusion. She thought about the life on the other side of that decision. Whether it was possible to build something real on a foundation whose original purpose was not what you thought it was. Whether love that arrived through the wrong door was still love when it arrived. Whether the plan, which had been Gbadebo's and then Tun's, was still the plan now that the man inside it had told his friends. He did not know if it mattered. And then she thought about a thing her father had told her once, when she was 17 and trying to decide whether to take a scholarship that would require her to leave her family. Leave Onitsha. Leave everything that felt like home for a place she could only imagine. He had been sitting on the front step in the evening, eating groundnuts from his palm one by one, and he had said, without looking up, "Adiz, the decision is never about where you are going. It is about who you decide to be when you get there. Whatever you choose, choose it as yourself. Not as what someone else needs you to be." She sat on the sofa in the Eco Grand Hotel for 8 minutes. Then she stood up. She smoothed her gown. She opened the door. Obi was on the other side. Of course she was. Adiz said, "Get my bag. I need my phone." And then, she paused, and something moved across her face that Obi could not name afterward when she tried to describe it. Something between exhaustion and decision and a kind of grief that had already made its peace with itself. And then she said, "And find out which room Tund is in." Obi said, "Ada, are you sure?" Adiz said, "I'm going to talk to him." Obi handed her the phone, and then, because she had known Adiz for 23 years and understood that certain things between them did not require explanation, she said only, "I will be right here." Adiz walked down the corridor alone. She did not knock on the door. She opened it. The room went still the way rooms do when something enters them that changes the air. The three friends, Emeka, Rodamai, Son, each did their own version of the same thing, which was to look for the exit that wasn't there. Tund was standing by the window. He turned when she entered, and his face did something that she would spend a long time afterward trying to describe to herself. It was not guilt exactly. It was not fear exactly. It was the face of a man who has been carrying something very heavy and has, in the moment the weight becomes visible, experienced both the relief of being seen and the full terror of what being seen means. She said, "I need everyone to leave." They left. Even Emeka, who tried for one moment to say something, and then looked at her face and did not. The door closed. The room was large and the morning light came through the windows onto the carpet and the furniture and Tund's hands, which were hanging at his sides in a way that made him look very young. She said, "I heard you." He said, "Ada," she said, "I am not asking you to explain. I am telling you that I heard you. I heard enough." The silence was the kind that has weight. Not emptiness. Something more solid. She looked at him. She thought about all the things a woman in her position might be expected to do. The tears, the accusations, the exit through the door with the gown trailing. She thought about the calculation that had brought her here and the calculation happening inside her right now, and she thought about the difference between a woman who reacts and a woman who decides. She had spent 35 years being the second kind of woman. She was not going to stop today. She said, "I want you to tell me the truth. All of it. Everything from the beginning." Tun's jaw moved once. Then he sat down on the nearest chair, which was the wrong kind of chair for the situation, a formal upholstered thing, and he told her. He told her about Gbadebo and the minister and the contract. He told her about the 4 months of trying to find another way. He told her about the conversation in which Gbadebo had said her name, and about the silence with which Tund had received it. He told her what he had told himself in the months that followed, and he told her the part he had not been able to tell himself until he had said it out loud to his friends 40 minutes ago, which was that somewhere inside those 8 months the plan had stopped being the reason and she had become the reason, and he did not know what to do with that because it had happened inside something that started wrong, and he did not have a way to make the start clean just because the middle had become something he had not expected. He told her all of it, and when he was done, he looked at his hands on his knees and he did not say anything else. She stood by the window. Outside, Lagos continued its loud, unremarkable business. She said, "Did you ever intend to tell me?" He said, "I don't know. I told myself I would find a way. I didn't know what the way looked like." She said, "That's not an answer." He said, "I know." She said, "Do you love me?" He looked up at her then. His face was the same face she had been looking at for 3 years, but it was also different in the way that a landscape is different once you know what is underneath it. He said, "Yes." And then he said, "I know that doesn't fix what this is. I know that." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that he did not expect and that she herself did not know she was going to say until it was already said. She said, "My company has been in conversations with the new Ministry of Works for 8 months. I have a connection to the permanent secretary there. His daughter was a client of mine before she moved to London. I could have helped you. If you had come to me with the problem, I would have helped you." Tund looked at her. Something in his face cracked open at the edges, and he did not bother trying to contain it. She said, "That's who I am. That's what you had without the plan. You could have just asked me." And that was the thing that broke him more completely than any accusation could have, because it was not an accusation. It was a true and simple description of who she was and what he had failed to see about her, which was that she was not a resource. She was a partner, and partners ask for help. And he had been so afraid of what he needed from her that he had turned her into something he could take rather than someone he could ask. And the difference between those two things was the thing that had been wrong from the very beginning, and he understood it now, in this room, in the worst possible moment and the only moment in which it was possible to understand it clearly. She said, "I need to go. I need to not be in this room right now." He said, "Ada." She stopped at the door. She did not turn around. He said, "I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry. Not because you found out. Because I did it." She went through the door. She walked back down the corridor and into the room where Obi was waiting, and she sat down, and for the first time since she had stood outside that door and heard his voice, she let herself feel the full weight of what was sitting in her chest. She did not cry theatrically. She did not fall apart. She sat on the sofa with her hands in her lap and she breathed in the way her mother had taught her, and she let the grief move through her in the slow, unglamorous way that real grief moves. Not like a storm, but like a tide that comes in and stays. Obi sat beside her and did not say anything, which was the exact right thing. After a long time, Adiz said, "I need to go home." Obi said, "Okay." Adiz said, "My parents are downstairs." Obi said, "I'll talk to them." Adiz said, "The guests." Obi said, "I'll handle it. You go." What happened downstairs, in the hall where 430 people were waiting for a wedding that did not happen, was managed with the particular combination of efficiency and warmth that only certain people are capable of in a crisis. Obi spoke to Adiz's parents first. Her mother took the information in the way Chidinma Okonkwo took every hard thing. Standing, with her chin slightly lifted, her hands very still. Her father sat down in the nearest chair and pressed both hands to his face for a moment, and then he stood back up because he was Emeka Okonkwo and he had been standing back up his entire life. Obi then spoke to the master of ceremonies, and then to the hotel manager, and then arranged, with the assistance of 3 of Adi's professional staff who had been guests and had quietly shifted into work mode the moment they understood the situation, for a brief and dignified announcement that the ceremony would not be proceeding. The food was released to the guests. The bar remained open. There was, as there always is in Lagos at an event with 400 people and an open bar and something dramatic to discuss, no shortage of conversation. Tun's mother, a small and formidable woman from Ibadan named Alhaja Adeyemi, found Adi's mother in the corridor near the elevator and said something to her that was short and low and direct. Chidinma Okonkwo listened, and then she said something back, and the 2 women looked at each other for a long moment in the particular way of women who understand exactly how much a son's mistake costs the people around him. Then Alhaja Adeyemi turned and walked away, and Chidinma watched her go, and then she went to find her daughter. Adiz had changed out of the wedding gown in the room upstairs. She had folded it. Not thrown it, not abandoned it, but folded it carefully and laid it across the sofa, and she was wearing the travel clothes she had packed for the honeymoon departure, which was an irony she noticed and set aside. Her mother came in and sat beside her on the sofa and did not say anything for a full minute. Then she said, "Tell me," and Adiz told her. All of it. Her mother listened with her hands folded and her face very still and her eyes on her daughter the entire time. When Adiz finished, Chidinma was quiet for another long moment. Then she said, not unkindly but without softness, "The question is not what he did. That is already known. The question is who you are after today, and how you carry it." Adiz said, "I don't know yet." Her mother said, "That's the right answer." The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the way stories sometimes are after a wedding that does not happen. There was no public collapse. There was no declaration. The Lagos press wrote about it in the way that Lagos press writes about events involving wealthy people, with detail and without accuracy, with opinions where facts were unavailable, with a speed that outpaced any attempt at control. Adiz's name was in 3 newspapers in the first week. She did not read them. She went to work. She worked the way she had worked before Tund, which was with complete dedication and no apology for it. She took meetings. She made decisions. She spoke at a conference in Accra the second week, and someone who had not followed the Lagos news said she was the sharpest voice in the room, and she said thank you and went back to her hotel and sat by the window and watched the lights of the city and felt the strange particular loneliness of being competent when what you actually need is to be held. She called her mother every Sunday. She called Obi more than that. She went to Onitsha for a weekend in the 3rd week, and she sat in her parents' front room and helped her father with something he was trying to repair and did not want to admit he couldn't. And her father, who had never been good with words but had always been good with presence, sat beside her and worked quietly, and at one point he put his hand briefly on her shoulder without looking up from what he was doing, and she felt that gesture go straight through all the careful structure she had built around herself in 3 weeks, and she pressed her lips together and held on. Tund did not call. This had been her only specific request, conveyed through Obi 2 days after the wedding that wasn't. She needed the silence. She was not ready for whatever the conversation would be, and she needed to arrive at that readiness on her own schedule, without the pressure of his voice making it complicated. He respected this. He waited. What she discovered, in those weeks of work and Onitsha weekends and Sunday calls with her mother and long evenings in her apartment with the lagoon outside the window, was something she had not expected to discover. She discovered that she was not entirely done. Not with Tund. Not with what they had been. Not even with the question of what it was possible for them to become, if anything, on the other side of what had happened. This is not a tidy thing to discover. It is not the discovery of a woman who has made a clean break and feels righteous in it. It is the messier, more honest discovery of a woman who loved someone and still loves him and is trying to work out what love means when the beginning of it was built on something wrong, and whether a thing can be rebuilt from a broken foundation or whether the foundation itself has to be laid again. She thought about it for 6 weeks. Not constantly, she was not a woman who allowed constant thinking about one thing. But in the edges of her days. In the minutes before sleep. In the particular quality of Sunday morning light through her apartment windows. At the end of 6 weeks she called Obi and said, I am going to talk to him. Obi said, Are you sure? Adiz said, No. But I'm going anyway. She drove herself. She did not tell him she was coming. She drove to his office building on a Thursday afternoon, and she sent a message from the parking lot. I am downstairs. If you have time. He came down in 4 minutes, which meant he had been sitting at his desk and done nothing except stand up and come to the elevator. He came out through the glass lobby doors and stopped when he saw her, and they looked at each other across the small distance of the parking area in the afternoon light with the noise of Victoria Island around them, and neither of them said anything for a moment. He had lost weight. His face was older than it had been. She was aware that she probably did not look like a woman who had spent the last 6 weeks in comfort either. She said, I don't know what I'm doing here. He said, I'm glad you're here. She said, That's not, you can't say things like that yet. He said, Okay. I'm sorry. She said, I have some questions. He said, All right. She said, Can we sit somewhere? Not here. They went to a small place nearby that sold pepper soup and soft drinks, the kind of place with plastic chairs and a television on the wall showing a football match with the sound turned down, the kind of place where two people who did not want to be observed would not be observed. They sat across from each other at a small table with cups of cold Fanta in front of them like a memory of being young, and she asked her questions and he answered them, and she asked more and he answered those, and when she got to the question she had been circling for 6 weeks she asked it directly. Was any of it real? He said, Yes. Everything after the first month. Maybe before that. I can't draw the line exactly because I didn't know where the line was when it was happening. She said, That's not very satisfying. He said, I know. I'm sorry, I don't have a cleaner answer. She said, What did you do about the contract? He said, I called Gbadebo the week after and told him we would find another way. We lost the contract. It nearly broke the company. We are finding another way. She looked at him. He did not look away. She said, You should have called me. About the contract. He said, I know that now. She said, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it. He said, I'm listening. She said, I was not with you because of what you could offer me. I was with you because of who you were when you sat in that conference room and asked the right question and laughed at the right moment and listened to me the way I had been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, for someone to listen to me. That's who you are. Whatever Gbadebo put in your head about what I was worth, that's not what I am. I am not a portfolio. I am not a connection. I am a person who loved you, and that person was sitting right in front of you the entire time, and you chose to use her instead of trust her. And that is the part one cannot move past quickly. That's the part that needs time. His mouth was closed and his jaw was very tight and he was looking at a spot on the table between them and he nodded once, slowly. She said, But I am not saying there is no way forward. I am saying it requires things from you that are different from anything you have given me so far. It requires you to come to me as a person who needs help and not as a person managing a resource. It requires you to tell me the truth even when the truth is inconvenient. It requires you to choose me as a person and not because of what I can do. And I need to believe, over time and through specific actions and not through one conversation, that you are actually capable of that. He said, I am. She said, We'll see. They sat in that small restaurant for another hour, not resolving anything, not arriving anywhere clean. They talked about his mother, who had gone to Onitsha and apologized to Chidinma Okonkwo in person. A journey of 6 hours each way, and who had told him, upon returning, that Adiz's mother was a formidable woman and that he had, through his own foolishness, nearly lost the finest person his son had ever managed to find. They talked about the company which was surviving. They talked about the contract that had been lost, and about the connection to the permanent secretary that Adiz had mentioned in that hotel room, and whether and how she would be willing to facilitate an introduction, not as a favor but as a business arrangement between two professionals who happened to be finding their way back toward each other. They talked about what that even meant. Finding their way back. Whether back was the right direction. Whether the destination was the same place or somewhere entirely new that would need a different name. When they stood up to leave, he walked her to her car. The evening was coming in and the traffic on the island was building to its nightly chaos, and somewhere down the street someone was selling suya from a metal cart, and the smell of it moved through the air like a memory of ordinary evenings. She opened her car door and he stood on the pavement with his hands in his pockets. He said, Adiz. She paused with her hand on the door. He said, I know I have no right to ask for anything. I know that. But I want you to know that I would do it differently. If I could begin again, knowing what I know now, I would come to you with the problem and ask for your help and tell you everything, and I would trust you with all of it. That's what I would do. She looked at him. She thought about her father on the front step in Onitsha, eating groundnuts one by one, saying choose it as yourself, not as what someone else needs you to be. She said, that's who I need you to be. Not the man who tells me what he would have done. The man who actually does it going forward. He said, I know. She got into her car. She drove home through Lagos in the dark with the city around her like a living thing, and she felt not happiness, not yet, but something that stood near it. Something like possibility. Something like the recognition that she was still, despite everything, entirely herself. That she had moved through the worst of it and come out on the other side still holding her own name. The months that followed were not easy. They should not have been easy, and they were not. Tund did not call every day, which was the right instinct. He called when he had something real to say. He sent her something her father would appreciate for his birthday. A particular kind of yam from a market in Ibadan that her father had once mentioned, offhand, in a conversation that Tund should not have retained but had. He showed up to things he had not been asked to show up to and was not performative about showing up. He was present and imperfect and consistently honest, which was the combination she had asked for and which proved, over months and not over weeks, to be real. Adiz, for her part, was not easy to love in the way she had not been easy to love before any of this. She was demanding and precise, and she required things to be said clearly, and she did not accept approximations of the truth. She held him accountable in specific, consistent, undramatic ways. She did not punish him. She did not withhold. She simply insisted, every day and in small ways, on being treated as herself rather than as a role in someone else's plan. And he learned slowly and with effort and without complaining about the effort how to do that. She called the permanent secretary's office. She made the introduction as a professional courtesy. The meeting happened. The contract did not materialize immediately, but the relationship did, and relationships built the right way have a longer arc than contracts. Gbadebo, for his part, resigned from the company 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, citing personal reasons that did not need to be examined too closely. Tund did not stop him. Adiz's mother called her one Sunday and asked how it was going. Adiz said she didn't know. Her mother said that was fine. Her mother said, you don't need to know yet. You just need to keep choosing, day by day, the thing that feels most like yourself. Adiz said, when did you get so wise? Her mother said, I have always been this wise. You just weren't listening before. There was no second proposal. Not yet. There was instead a slow, specific, daily construction of something that had better foundations than the first thing, because it was built by 2 people who had already seen each other at their worst and had decided to keep building anyway. Not because they were perfect. Not because what had happened could be unwound. But because what they found in each other, under and after and in spite of all of it, was worth the work of building it right. Adiz did not forgive Tund in one moment. She forgave him in pieces across months, in the private accounting that a person does with themselves when they are trying to decide what they can afford to carry and what they need to set down. She set it down piece by piece. Not because he deserved her peace, but because she deserved it. Because the weight of someone else's mistake is a thing you carry for yourself, not for them, and she was not willing to carry it forever. Her father, on a visit to Lagos some months after all of this, met Tund for lunch and sat with him for 2 hours. Adiz did not know what they talked about. When Emeka Okonkwo came home that evening he said only, over the pepper soup her mother had made, that Tund had good eyes. And Chidinma said, good eyes for what? And Emeka said, good eyes for knowing what he nearly lost. There is a thing that happens in the life of a person who has survived something they were not sure they could survive, which is that the world on the other side of it looks different. Not simpler, not rosier, not healed into something prettier than it was before. Just different. Seen from a new angle. With a knowledge inside it that was not there before, a kind of permanent understanding of what things actually weigh when you hold them up to the light. Adiz stood at her apartment window one morning, about a year after the morning in the Eco Grand Hotel corridor, with a cup of tea going cold in her hands exactly the way it used to. And she thought, I am still myself. I am more myself than I was. Because the woman who had stood in that corridor and chosen not to react but to decide, that woman was not new. She had always been there. She had just, in that moment, needed to know it. What this story wants to leave with you is this. There are people in this world who will see your value and seek to take it before they have learned to appreciate it. They are not all monsters. Sometimes they are frightened. Sometimes they are cornered. Sometimes they genuinely do not know the difference between what you are worth and who you are, and sometimes, if you give them the chance, they learn. That is not a promise. It is not a formula. It is something that depends on things you cannot control and something that depends entirely on things you can. What you can always control is this: how clearly you see yourself. Whether you know the difference between being chosen for what you offer and being chosen for who you are. Whether you are willing to require the second one. Whether you trust your own assessment of the world enough to walk into a conversation that terrifies you rather than walk away from it and spend the rest of your life wondering. There is no shame in having been deceived by someone you loved. The shame, if there is any, belongs entirely to the person who chose to deceive. And even that shame is complicated because most people who deceive are also people who are afraid, and fear is not an excuse but it is an explanation, and explanations make the world make sense even when they do not make it right. The second thing. What you need from someone who has hurt you is not their regret. Regret is a feeling and feelings are not enough. What you need is changed behavior, specific and sustained and present in the small decisions of ordinary days. Not in the grand gesture. Not in the dramatic apology. In whether they show up when they said they would. Whether they tell you the truth when the truth is inconvenient. Whether they learn, day by day, to choose you as a person rather than a position. If they can do that, there may be something to build with. If they cannot, then you have learned the most important thing you needed to know, and that knowledge, however painful, is also a form of freedom. And the third thing. The woman who stood in that corridor and did not cry and did not run and did not perform her devastation for anyone. She made a decision. Not the decision that everyone around her expected. Not the decision that would have been easiest or safest or most comfortable for the people watching. She made the decision that was most true to who she was, which was to walk toward the thing rather than away from it, to ask the questions rather than avoid the answers, to know the whole shape of the truth rather than only the piece that had already landed. Not because she was brave in a dramatic way, because she was herself, fully and without apology, at the exact moment when that was the hardest thing in the world to be. That is the highest thing any of us can aspire to. In the corridor of our particular crisis, wearing whatever gown or coat or ordinary clothing we happen to be wearing on the day the door we thought we were opening turns out to lead somewhere else. In that moment, to remain recognizably, undeniably ourselves. And so before we part, there is one question I want to leave sitting with you. Is there someone in your life right now who values what you can do for them so completely that they have forgotten, or perhaps never learned, to value who you actually are? And if there is, what are you going to do about it?